Hello, welcome to Rachel Paints Poorly. My name is Rachel and I paint poorly. Today, we will be painting Berthe Morisot's Woman at Her Toilette. I know! It's been a while since we've mangled any masterpieces here on Rachel Paints Poorly, so I figured we'd jump back into it with one of my favorite Impressionists. Quick disclaimer, there are a lot of French words that will be tripping out of my mouth, and for that I apologize. I never studied a lick of French in my entire life. Je suis désolée. So, who was Berthe Morisot, and how did she come to paint Woman at Her Toilette?
Marie-Pauline Berthe Morisot was born on January 14, 1841, in Bourges, France, to Edmé Tiburce Morisot and Marie-Joséphine Cornélie Morisot. Her father graduated from the École des Beaux-Arts and trained as an architect. However, he chose to enter civil service as a prefect. Growing up in an affluent middle-class family, Berthe's artistic ambitions were not only supported, but encouraged by her family. At the age of 16, her mother took her and her two older sisters to the studio of Geoffrey-Alphonse Chocarne for drawing lessons, intending to surprise her husband with the three girls' drawings. While their oldest sister, Eve, was put off by the instructor and turned to needlework, Berthe and Edma took a liking to drawing, though they insisted on finding a new teacher. He took the form of Joseph Benoit Gouchard, who taught the sisters how to work with pastels. According to their younger brother, Tiburce, Gouchard had an early warning for their mother. Quote, "Your daughter's talents are not the modest ornamental ability that my teaching could give them. These girls will be painters. Do you realize what this means? In your upper bourgeoisie milieu, this is a revolution. I might almost say a catastrophe. Are you sure that you will never rue the day when art, having entered a once respectable, peaceful home, becomes the sole master of your two children's destinies?" End quote.
He would prove to be half correct.
The sisters labored alongside one another for years, copying the masterpieces of the Louvre, then moved on to working in plein air, for which they transferred to the tutelage of Jean-Baptiste Camille Corot. In addition to nature, Corot also had the sisters copy his own paintings. Edma, with her perfect copies, easily earned Corot's praise. Berthe and her less than faithful attempts, however, earned his criticism. She destroyed most of these early attempts. In 1864, both Edma and Berthe experienced the success of exhibiting at the Paris Salon with two paintings each. They continued to exhibit between 1864 and 1867, and their work was displayed in the gallery of art dealer Alfred Cadar, although sales were less than stellar. In 1869, Edma married Adolphe Pontillon and gave up her artistic career, leaving Berthe to pursue art on her own.
And so, without further ado, let's get started, shall we?
Modern novelists and modern painters bore me. I like either extreme novelty or things of the past. Berthe Morisot. April 15, 1874. The opening of the Anonymous Cooperative Society of Artists, Painters, Sculptors, and Engravers, the first Impressionist exhibition, in which Berthe exhibited 10 works, 4 oil paintings, 3 watercolors, 2 pastels, and 1 piece that was not included in the catalog. While she was often spared the harsh criticism lobbed at Édouard Manet and Claude Monet, Berthe was not immune from the wit of Le Chevalier's Louis Leroy, who quipped, quote, "Tell me about Mademoiselle Morisot. This young person is perfectly unconcerned with the reproduction of a host of pointless details. When she has a hand to paint, she gives as many long strokes of the brush as there are fingers, and there it is." End quote. Her subject's fingers notwithstanding, other critics more readily acknowledged Berthe's merits as an artist. In 1877, Georges Rivery exclaimed, quote, "Her watercolors, her pastels, her paintings all show a light touch and unpretentious allure that we can only admire. Mademoiselle Morisot has an extraordinarily sensitive eye. The young woman at her toilet is a delightful picture, as is the young woman before her looking glass. Hanging above these is a charming young woman in a blue dress. Mademoiselle Berthe Morisot succeeds in capturing fleeting notes on her canvases with a delicacy, spirit, and skill that ensure her a prominent place at the center of the Impressionists group." End quote. Amongst this group of artists, Berthe's work was held in high regard, and she was considered an equal in the Impressionist movement from its beginning. Recognizing her talent, her fellows sought to acquire her works themselves. Camille Pissarro selected View of Tivoli, Alfred Sisley, Before the Mirror, while Edgar Degas owned In a Villa at the Seaside. The harbor at Lorient belonged to Édouard Manet. In 1868, Berthe was formally introduced to Manet. They started painting together, and she began posing for The Balcony, the first of his depictions of her. While not a member of the Impressionist group per se, Manet was linked to them, in no small part through his relationship with Berthe. Their friendship was both professional and personal, with Berthe posing for 14 portraits between 1869 and 1874, ranging from brief sketches to in-depth pieces. As fellow artists, the older Manet recognized her talent and offered encouragement, though Berthe was never one of his pupils. Their use of the same subject material and themes was common amongst the Impressionists, and the sharing and inspiration went both ways. As a sitter, Berthe's very essence was captured in Manet's superb Berthe Morisot with a Bouquet of Violets, which she purchased herself over 20 years later, in 1894. French poet Paul Valéry considered this work to be the apex of Manet's career. Of Berthe, he said, quote, "Her being, simple, pure, intimately, passionately hardworking, rather withdrawn, but elegantly so. She was the rarest and most reserved of characters, the essence of distinction. Comfortably, dangerously silent, she imposed an inexplicable distance. Everything in her habits and looks spoke of careful choice. Berthe Morisot inhabited her large eyes, whose extraordinarily attentive gaze and constant activity gave her that curious air, distant and distancing." End quote. Of her looks and personality, poet Henry de Regnier opined, she was, quote, "tall and slim, with an extremely distinguished manner and mind. Her face had retained its striking, enigmatic quality, its expression of quiet melancholy. She seemed aloof and distant, with an infinitely intimidating reserve. But her coolness also communicated a charm to which it was impossible to remain indifferent. Berthe Morisot listened more readily than she spoke, and her taciturn nature sometimes caused uncomfortable silences in the conversation." End quote. Édouard wasn't the only Manet to paint Berthe. In 1874, she married Eugene, the middle Manet brother. An artist in his own right, he never attained the same status as his older brother or his wife. Nevertheless, Eugene and Berthe painted together throughout their marriage. Along with their daughter Julie, Eugene appears in several of Berthe's works. Of his performance in the role of sitter, Berthe wrote to her sister Edma, quote, "The poor man has taken your place, but he is a less obliging model. At once it becomes too much for him." End quote. Eugene served as the rare male sitter for Berthe, whose oeuvre was dominated by the feminine. Indeed, Impressionism itself was particularly suited to the feminine in its serious treatment of everyday scenes of life in the interior, with domestic space being the traditional domain of women. Taking the concept one step further, to scenes of sitting rooms and garden spaces, Berthe added genre painting of the female toilet. While imagery of a woman at her toilette goes back millennia, Berthe's interpretation was the modernization of a Rococo invention, that of the stylish Parisienne. This fashionable lady came to life in the gauzy works of Jean-Antoine Watteau, François Boucher, and their followers throughout the pre-Revolution 18th century, and was revived alongside the rest of the Rococo movement throughout the 19th. By the 1850s and 1860s, the Rococo revival had permeated the arts, fashion, literature, and theater. Contemporary critics like Denis Diderot characterized the grace, heavy use of bright colors, especially white and pink, technical skill of brushwork, and a focus on ornamental scenes utilized by Rococo artists as inherently feminine. Indeed, Diderot's salon criticisms were of great import to 19th century art critics, who began declaring Berthe and her modern works of femininity to be the successor to the Rococo movement. Philippe Berthe exclaimed, quote, "Morisot handles her brush and palette with a truly astonishing delicacy. Not since the 18th century, not since Jean-Honoré Fragonard, have we seen such a comparable intellectual audacity and clarity of tone." End quote. Charles Ephrussi stated, quote, "Mademoiselle Berthe Morisot is truly French in her distinction, elegance, high spirits, and insouciance. She grinds the petals of flowers on her palette, only to lay them out once more on her canvas, scattered as though by chance, in spiritual brush strokes, full of the breath of life. The faces are young and pretty, the poses relaxed, the movements graceful, seen through delicate gray tones, muted whites, and bright pinks, with no shadow, set off with spots of various colors, the whole ensemble giving the impression of vague and uncertain opaline tints. This fleeting lightness, this charming, sparkling, frivolous vivacity recalls Fragonard, though without the deep science, solidity of surface, and diffuse light that makes the master's paintings so homogeneous." End quote. This characterization continued even posthumously, with Paul Girard writing in a La Chivière piece on an 1896 exhibition of her works, quote, "She gives, particularly to children and young women, a grace to which she alone knows the secret. For we have looked closely, and it is impossible to discover her working methods in any of her paintings. It is the 18th century modernized." End quote. Berthe's utilization of Rococo imagery and stylization was present throughout her career. While her loose application of white paint in fragmented strokes as a unification method of the figure with the background was used by the Rococo masters, her habit of leaving the corners of her canvases mostly or entirely unpainted and her extreme lack of finishing her pieces took her work into a decidedly impressionistic modern style. So too was her desire to have her work appear as if it was painted in one sitting, while simultaneously admitting to her sister, quote, "I feel quite stupid setting up my easel before something and fancying myself able in an hour's time to replicate nature." End quote. Failed paintings were discarded instead of reworked, as Berthe's, quote, "principle was never to try to rectify a blunder." End quote. Marie Renard, one of Berthe's models, recollected, quote, "Dressed in her fine gowns, I was frequently represented on her canvases in the midst of a beautiful garden. Berthe Morisot did not have a studio. She had me pose in her salon, and usually I took the part of girls in their dressing rooms or at the theater." End quote. While working, quote, "She always painted standing up, walking back and forth before her canvas. She would stare at her subject for a long time, and her look was piercing, her hand ready to place her brush strokes just where she wanted them." End quote. Her loose, singular style of quick brushwork differed not only from the similar interior scenes of the realist painters of the time, but also from her Impressionist contemporaries. From 1877 on, she was recognized for her rendering of natural light using a silver or blonde palette. Of the third Impressionist exhibit, Paul Mance asserted, quote, "The truth is that if there is a single Impressionist in the group, it is Berthe Morisot. Her painting has all the freshness of improvisation. Here is where we really find the impression perceived by a sincere eye, faithfully rendered by a hand that does not lie." End quote. While she had success with the critics, her success with buyers was less resounding. In a correspondence with her sister, she lamented, quote, "You ask me what I am doing. Not much. It looks as though I am coming to the end of my life without having achieved anything and only selling my work at bargain prices. It is terribly depressing." End quote. Throughout her life, the sales of Berthe's art were modest at best, selling 25 to 40 paintings and giving away approximately another 25. The majority of her cataloged works were in her family's possession at the time of her death, about 85% of 423 paintings. It was through the efforts of her family, most notably her daughter Julie and her son-in-law Ernst Rouart, that her oeuvre is now more widely known. In 1961, a comprehensive catalog was published of Berthe's paintings, watercolors, and pastels using documents provided by Julie. She also helped organize a retrospective the same year at the Paris Musée Jacquemart André. To rediscover Berthe Morisot is to rediscover Impressionism. What once was startling and new is made fresh again, and the brilliant discovery of the omnipresence of light throughout all things is brought forth once more. In her final years, Berthe created works composed exclusively of color and light, the culmination of her career and her swan song. In her notebook, she wrote, quote, "With what resignation we arrive at the end of life, resigned to all its failures on the one hand, all its uncertainties on the other. For so long I have hoped for nothing, and the desire for glorification after death seems to me an overblown ambition. My own ambition has been confined to a desire to fix something of all that passes. Oh, something, the least little thing. Well, that ambition, too, is overblown." End quote. She died on March 2nd, 1895, at the age of 54, the first of the founding Impressionists to pass. Full of youth and bloom, her works continue to refresh and restore today, capturing the expression of an artist obsessed with the fleeting passage of time for successive audiences. I say, I should like to die, but that's not true at all. I should like to get younger. Youth and old age are similar in more ways than one, and they are the two moments in life when one can feel one's own soul, which would be proof that it exists. And there you have it, Berthe Morisot's Woman at Her Toilette. Thank you so much for watching. Until next time, bye.
iNsouCiAnCe. 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 Omelette du fromage.